I started writing shortly after college. I was a copywriter in a small advertising firm, so I wrote mostly radio commercials and TV commercials and brochures. And it was during this time I was handling a political race when I wrote my first book, The Christmas Box. And that's where it all began. It started as originally a Christmas present for my two daughters, continued to grow and spread as people asked for copies, and that was some 8 million copies ago. So I was one of those lucky authors who hit it big with his first work. As I thought about what to write about, I had heard that you should always write from someplace that you're very passionate about, something that's deep within your heart. And I thought, well, I want to write about fatherhood. I want to write about the experience of being a father and my children and what it means to me. And that's where my writing began, because I began writing The Christmas Box. I think I wrote a Christmas story because it was Christmas time. It was early November, and I had this idea of giving this book as a Christmas present to my daughters, and so it was kind of happenstance. I just happened to be right then. Otherwise, it might be like the Valentine's box or something. I don't know. I began writing this story, and it helped into the whole process because I handed out as Christmas presents, and that's how the book was initially shared. When I finished writing The Christmas Box, I decided I would make it into a trilogy. So I would write a prequel, and actually two prequels to the book, and that was Timepiece and then The Letter. And when I finished that, I decided I didn't want to write Christmas stories anymore. I was afraid of being typecast, kind of like Christopher Reeves became Superman in every movie he was in afterward. And so I shied away from Christmas stories, and for really almost a decade, and about every other author in the world rushed back in. Everyone from John Grisham to David Baldacci to Mary Higgins Clark all began writing Christmas stories. After a few years of that, nearly a decade, I thought, what am I running from? This is really who I am, and this is where it started. And so I started a new Christmas series, and it began with Finding Noel, and sales were up almost 100,000 copies over the year before, and I thought this definitely has found the readers. That's how they know me, and I followed up with The Gift, and again, sales continue to rise. So it was a good move, but from a personal level, I've always loved Christmas, and I guess I've been doing this long enough now that I'm not afraid of being typecast. I will always be the author of The Christmas Box, and I'm very proud of that. And I just don't really care anymore. I'm writing things that I like to write, and I enjoy writing, and my readers enjoy reading, so that's all that matters. The idea of The Gift came from almost two different experiences. The one was being raised in a family where healing was something that was openly talked about. My grandfather had what Christians call gifts of the Spirit, and so I saw some very miraculous healings take place in my childhood. I think the most demonstrative is what happened to my brother. We had just moved from Los Angeles to Utah, and one Saturday we were climbing a tree out in front of the house when suddenly my brother, who was ahead of me, there was a loud zap as my brother grabbed a 7,000-volt power line. And he fell from the tree to the ground, and I scurried down the tree screaming for my mother, and when she came out, he was lying motionless on the ground. There were two holes in his shoes where the electricity had blown out, and we thought he was dead. And my mother began shaking him and calling him, and suddenly, to our relief, he began to cry, and I'll never forget, he said, "My hand hurts," and he lifted his hand, and I could see a very grotesque burn mark. The wire actually burned all the way to the bone, and you could actually see the cords of the strand that he had grabbed onto. That night, my grandfather came over to the house and gave my brother a blessing. And in this blessing, he was told that his hand would heal perfectly, that there'd be no mark or scar or blemish. As you know from burn victims, and anyone with a third-degree burn, it never heals perfectly. And just a month later, when the doctor took the bandage off my brother's hand, he was stunned to see that there was actually no mark or scar of any kind. This was something that I was raised with. We just accepted healing as part of our reality. And it wasn't until later that I realized that this was exceptional, that people didn't really believe this. And so on some level, I think all of my books have been about healing. And The Christmas Box, I believe, was so successful in part because of the healing it brought people, especially people who were suffering the loss of children. Now, the other reason this book came to be, I think, is during that process of The Christmas Box selling, I was receiving so many letters and comments from people, and I was getting a lot of contacts from people who claimed to have near-death experiences. And this was very curious to me because the book really isn't about a near-death experience. And so I wasn't really sure why they were contacting me. But I became very curious. I began about this phenomenon, and I began researching it. And what I learned is that people who had had near-death experiences, they tended to have very difficult lives afterwards. They would oftentimes get divorced, they would lose their jobs, have trouble keeping jobs, It was as if they had checked out of this life, ready to move on to the next. Except for children who also experience near-death experiences, they have a different way of viewing things. They're not so culturalized or socialized that they can accept simultaneous realities. In the same way a child can watch a cartoon and think it's real. They have no problem with seeing a relative who might have deceased through a near-death experience. It's no different from being in another state as it is in being into another realm. And so the idea of a child having a near-death experience was just really intriguing to me. But also, some of these children reportedly came back with gifts. I remember reading one woman saying that her son, after having a near-death experience, could suddenly play the piano, almost as a concert pianist on that level. He had never trained the piano. He just, after he came back, he just started playing. I thought, what an interesting concept, and so I made my character, Colin, this little boy who's had a near-death experience, gave him the power to heal people, and that's the gift he brings back. And so those two things, the idea of healing and the idea of this near-death experience, I think they provided such a kind of a delicious platform to build a story around. I couldn't resist it, and I think made for a very interesting reading story.